In late July of 1838, Joseph Smith sent out a warning and counsel to all the saints in Missouri to live in the cities, to gather to the centers of the saints, still run their farms in the country, but live in the cities. This would be a prophetic warning, one that the saints did not listen to. Earlier in the year, the saints had begun settling in Daviess County as well as Clinton and other counties in the area. Now, when Caldwell County was created, it was created as a reserve for the Mormons, and with the understanding, whether explicitly in law or just an agreement, that the saints would not settle in any town outside of Caldwell unless 2/3 of the previous residents agreed to let them settle. However, in Daviess County, as well as others, there was much land that had not been organized into townships, and nobody lived there. And so the saints went and homesteaded these lands, such as the city of Adam-on-Diamond. They platted out the cities, they registered it with all the proper legal authorities, and they began spreading out in this way, all done legally and all within the bounds of the agreement that had been made. However, the early settlers began once again to resent the industry and prosperity of the saints. And a animosity arose. And in Daviess County, the county election approached to elect state representatives to the state legislature. There was a Judge Morin who went to the saints and gave them the friendly warning that the other settlers were determined to prevent them from voting. He still encouraged them, go out and vote, exercise your rights, but go prepared for a fight, go armed. In Daviess County, the election was held at the county seat of Gallatin. There were not a whole lot of members in Daviess County at this time, and about 11 went to vote at the Gallatin poll. But they did not heed Judge Morin's warning, and they went unarmed, not expecting anything. What they were faced with was a mob of between 50 and 100 men. They were harangued and harassed, and when they tried to vote, they were physically attacked. At first, they simply tried to defend themselves, and a few tried to get out of the fray, but the mob was determined to kill them. And after about a half a dozen were overwhelmed by the mob, one John Lowe Butler stepped in, grabbing a 3-foot oak club, and began defending his brethren. With every stroke of his club, he would knock another mobber unconscious on the ground, breaking jaws, breaking skulls, causing severe injury at every turn. And single-handedly, he would fell between 15 and 20 men, and the rest of the mob would run, screaming in fear. John Lowe Butler is a particular favorite of mine and my wife's because he is my wife's great-great-great-grandfather, I believe. And if not for his intervention at this time, a number of the brethren would have been killed at Gallatin. Now, the immediate aftermath, the mob sent off the rumor, actually sent a man down to Far West to report to the saints that 2 of the saints had been killed, 2 of their brethren had been killed, and the mob was preventing them from being buried. This was done to provoke the saints because they wanted to try and come up with an excuse to attack the Mormons. So they were trying to provoke the Mormons into retaliation, into violence. Joseph Smith, on the 8th, would go up into the area and he would investigate. He would also confront some of the leaders of the mob, particularly a Judge Adam Black. And when he was satisfied that the saints were not in immediate danger and he had secured a pledge from Judge Black that he would not help the mob, Joseph and the other brethren from Far West returned. By the 13th, Judge King ordered the arrest of Joseph Smith and Lyman White on the charge of threatening Adam Black and calling for all the Missourians to be driven from Daviess County. The sheriff from Daviess County came down to issue the warrants to collect Joseph and Lyman. They asked to simply be tried in Far West in Caldwell County. The sheriff went and conferred with Judge King and returned saying that they were outside of his jurisdiction and he would not do anything, and these arrest warrants were never fulfilled. But we have more false accusations begin to circulate of the saints being on the move, the saints being violent. going against those of Daviess County. And at this time, Governor Boggs calls the militia to be on the ready. He does not muster them out, but he says to be on the ready in case something happens. All this is going on. The mobs are trying to provoke the saints into retaliation, but the saints do not fall for it. Then we come to September. Joseph contacts General Atchison, who is his lawyer, and Judge King. Atchison counsels that Joseph and Lyman turn themselves over for trial, and Judge King is asked to come out and try the case. This trial takes place between the 5th and 7th of September, and at the end, Joseph and Lyman White are released on a $500 bail each, which they pay, even though the judge himself says that there is no legal reason to even require this bond, because no crime had been committed. On the 9th, a shipment of guns that was being sent to the mob in Daviess County is intercepted by the militia in Far West, confiscated, and the men who are in charge of the shipment are arrested. Atchison, he is a general of the militia, as well as Joseph Smith's personal lawyer, and he is ordered by Judge King to raise the militia and go out and quell the mob. So Atchison assembles a militia from Ray County. In addition, there's a militia assembled by a General Donaphin under the command of Atchison, but Donaphin, he raises his militia out of Clay County. At about the same time, on the 12th of September, a mob forms about 50 men in Carroll County at the city of DeWitt, threatening the saints there. Donaphin marches to Far West. He takes charge of the prisoners and releases them. He also reclaims the guns because they belong legally to the people of Richmond in Ray County. He then marches into Daviess County, sets up his camp between the mob and the saints. He gets the mob who is not from Daviess County. The mob is from many different counties. And he gets them to disperse to go back to their home counties, leaving the mob with between 40 and 50 men left out of about 250. And when it is reduced to this size, the rest disperse and leave the saints. The saints, being only on the defensive, also disperse once the mob is gone. And in this way, peace is restored to Daviess temporarily. 2 companies of militia are left in Daviess County for a few months to keep things calm. But the mob is not satisfied with this, and so they simply shift from Daviess County over to Carroll County and set in a siege of the city of DeWitt. It is also at this time that Governor Boggs calls out even more militia, I believe under the command of General Lucas. It is on October 1st that the mob has amassed 300 men surrounding the city of DeWitt, and on the 2nd they open fire on the saints. Shortly after, there are reports both from General Lucas and from General Atchison to Governor Boggs. Of course, Lucas's reports are filled with inflammatory accusations and false claims, while Atchison gives a much more honest report. Joseph Smith is also informed of the siege at DeWitt, and he goes there to help the saints. He has to sneak into the city because the mob has set up such a perimeter around the city that people cannot get in or out. It is very difficult. He does make it in, but only just barely without being caught. And shortly after, the mob starts destroying property. Up to this time, they've only surrounded the city, besieging it, not letting provisions come in or out. And because of this, many of the saints inside are starting to feel the effects of starvation and thirst. Some of them even begin to die because of this. The mob at this time consists of men from Ray, Saline, Howard, Livingston, Clinton, Clay, Platte, and Jackson County. And after just over a week of this siege, with General Hinkle or Captain Hinkle of the militia, he is at this time a strong leader in the church and in the militia, refusing to give in to the mob. But after a week of this siege, Joseph Smith counsels, we need to get out of here. The mob agrees to let them leave and go to Far West. They also agree to pay them for all their land, which of course never happens. By the 12th, the saints have arrived in Far West, but most of them have to walk the entire way. And because of the exposure to the elements and their weakened condition of the siege, A number of them also die along the way. At this point, the mobs realize that the law, the government, is going to do nothing to stop them, and so they once again return to Daviess County, burning the houses of the saints on the way, terrorizing the people. And once the saints from DeWitt are in Far West, the Far West militia is called out under the command of Hinkle, who was the highest commanding officer in the militia, and he had done a good job in DeWitt. And so his militia marches up to Daviess County. In addition, Lyman White, who is another commander of the militia, marshals out the militia in Adamondiaman. And with the Far West and Adamondiaman militias going into Daviess, the mob is once again dispersed and quelled. But they fall into the underground, taking up a more strategy, where this time, instead of burning the saints' homes, they move all their own possessions out of their homes and then burn their homes, blaming the saints and spreading rumors that the saints are trying to drive the old settlers out of these counties, out of Daviess County specifically. This stirs up a lot of the populace, these false rumors. A bunch of it gets to Governor Boggs. And this just presents a general atmosphere of persecution against the saints. It's at this time that Orson Hyde quietly leaves Far West, and he will fall into apostasy for a short time. There's also, by the 22nd of September, there are mob activities on the border of Caldwell County between Ray and Caldwell. Now, there was a strip of land between Caldwell in the north and Ray in the south that was in neither county. This was a narrow strip that had not been incorporated into any county. It was unsettled land. And this is where we get the mob activity starts growing. By the 24th, Thomas B. Marsh also leaves. He falls into apostasy. And within a day, him and Orson Hyde are both speaking out against Joseph Smith, confirming the false reports that have been spread and accusing the brethren. One thing that they accuse them of regards the Danites, which I will talk about briefly in a moment, but that is their main accusation that Thomas B. Marsh supports to the mob. It is on the 24th, the day that Thomas B. Marsh starts his testimonies against the brethren, that we have what is known as the Battle of Crooked River, or Crooked Creek. And this was 3 men are taken prisoner by the mob in this narrow strip of land between the 2 counties. And so Hinkle sends a detachment of the militia from Far West, consisting of 75 men under the command of David Patton. And they go down to rescue these 3 men who have been taken prisoner. Now Patton, he is one of the 12. He is, in fact, at this time, would be the new president of the 12 after Thomas B. Marsh had apostatized. Although, since this is all happening on the same day, he is never formally ordained to that position. He goes out with his men. They do manage to rescue the 3 who were taken prisoner, but in the ensuing fight, 4 or 5 of the saints are killed, including David Patton. He is shot in the stomach. The wound is severe enough that they cannot even get him back to Far West before he dies. His wife and some of the brethren, including Joseph Smith, come out to see him as he is dying. And one of the last things he says to his wife is, "Whatever else you do, never deny the faith." David Patton died a great man and a faithful man, a servant of Christ, and he was the first apostle to be killed in this dispensation. 2 days later, they hold his funeral service, and on that same day, Governor Boggs issues his infamous extermination order. This is the 27th of October. Now I'll make brief mention of the group known as the Danites. Now the Danites had been organized much earlier, I think in July, as a defensive measure for the saints. The leader of the Danites was a man named Samson Avard, Dr. Samson Avard. And he had recently joined the church he had the goal of overthrowing both the civil government and the church and establishing himself as the supreme ruler. So he convinces many of the brethren to join this secret organization of the Danites, telling them it is for the protection of the saints. And for the most part it was. Just after the death of David Patton, The Danites, having been organized into regular companies of 10s and 50s, Dr. Avard calls a meeting of all of his captains, and he says it is now time to go out and rob and plunder the mob, because that is what God wants them to do. They are going to overthrow the mob by robbing and plundering. He quotes the Bible to try and support this claim, but his captains, all of them, refuse to follow him from this point. And they say, no, we went into this to defend the saints. We are not going to go attack other people. And Dr. Avard gets very angry. He leaves. He actually joins the mob. But the Danites are the ones that are then blamed for all the house burning and everything, even though they never actually did anything. They were not part of that, especially after Avard joins the mob, claiming to, give the real story, to tell them really what happened. It gives more credence to the false accusations against the saints. Now, the Danites were never endorsed by Joseph Smith. Avard did claim that they were commanded to organize by Joseph Smith, but Joseph never even knew of their existence until this time. 3 days later is the massacre of Hans Mill. A mob of about 50 men, I believe, swept through the city or the town, killing most of the men there and just ravaging the entire place. I don't want to get into the details in this video, but it was on the same day that the militia, 2,000 men, march on the city of Far West, declaring that they are there to take possession of it in the name of the governor. However, it is not until the 31st that Governor Boggs' extermination order actually reaches them, and so they are not acting under proper authority at the time. On the 31st, Atchison quits the army. He says he will have no part in this. Hinkle is called out to negotiate with the mob militia here, and he agrees, in part, to turn over the leaders of the church, including Joseph Smith, as prisoners, as well as disarming the militia at Far West. He does this through treachery, telling Joseph Smith and others that the mob just wants to discuss a peaceful resolution. And as soon as they get out there, he turns them over. They are arrested, thrown in chains. At this time, it is Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Parley P. Pratt, Lyman White, and one George Washington Robinson that are taken prisoner. The next day, Hiram Smith and Amasa Lyman are also taken prisoner. It is also at this time that Hinkle leads the Far West militia just outside the city and orders them to turn over their guns to the mob. Since they are now outside the city and surrounded by a force 4 times greater than theirs, they comply. On the 1st of November, there is a sham trial held, or court-martial, where Joseph Smith and all the other prisoners are condemned to be executed in the town center of Far West as an example to all those other Mormons. But General Donaphin, he now says he will have no part in it. He takes his brigade and leaves, but before he leaves, he tells General Lucas that if he goes through with it, he will have him before an earthly tribunal, because it is nothing short of murder. Fearing General Donaphin, Lucas agrees not to have them killed. He then gets word from a General Clark from Ray County, who was recently called out by Governor Boggs, to have the prisoners shipped down to them in Richmond in Ray County. Now, for some reason, they first go to Independence, which is a little farther south, where Joseph Smith is able to preach to the people. After that, they are taken to Richmond, where they stand trial. At this trial, many witnesses are called against them. They provide lists of witnesses in their favor, but whenever they provide a name, that person is simply hunted down and thrown in prison themselves and not allowed to testify. There are some in Richmond who stand up to give voice on their behalf, but as soon as they do, they are chased out at gunpoint so that their testimony cannot be heard. This is not just members of the church. There are non-members who are standing up to defend the saints, and they are also being chased out at gunpoint. Once this sham trial is held, this trial is not to convict, but to determine charges. And once that is done, they are shipped to Liberty Jail, Clay County, where they will spend the next 6 months in a hellhole in the ground. And this is what has become known as the Mormon Missouri War. Now, it will continue for most of the spring of 1839, but we will talk about that in a future video.